the managerial group? Did it start with the board? Where did that impetus come from for that change in culture? Do you know?
I would imagine the change comes from above in something like Millwall, because also as a club, I don't know why I picked Millwall, but it's turned out to be a really good example. But they also tend to appoint a lot of ex-players as their manager. So those ex-players come in and they've got the beliefs and the values that they had before when they were there as a player. So they're used to the rough and ready approach. But I think the club made a policy many years ago to try and cut down on the hooliganism, and it affected their crowds. Less people went to the matches. But they swallowed that pill. They suffered a little bit. Their crowds went down, but they tried to lose the hooligan element of the club. And in some ways, in recent years, I think they've managed to achieve that, and they've become more of a family club. So that was elite. That was from the very top of the club. So that becomes the club culture. And then from that, following on, you get in club football, your manager changes all the time, unfortunately, because you keep losing your job. But your manager changes all the time. And that manager has to come in and embrace the culture of the club, but bring his own ideas and his own culture, which might be slightly different. So the club has to be choosy as to who they bring in to be their next manager. If Millwall, for example, keep going back to get ex-players who are used to the rough and ready approach, there'll always be a conflict between the club culture and the culture of the coach. So looking ahead, maybe Millwall will look to go outside always picking one of their old players as the manager.
Does anybody have any thoughts on that in your own environments?
Would you not say, though, Steve, that the club's culture is driven by the fans? I mean, you're in the middle of the Docklands and you pick Millwall, but you're in the middle of the Docklands. I mean, when I used to go over there, I was frightened to park my car.
Yeah, it is driven by the fans, but those fans at some time have to realise that their behaviour should also be part of the culture of the club.
I don't think they think that. I think they just go there and
they go for a tear-up.
Yeah. But that's changing now. It's definitely
changed, and it definitely affected the crowds that they were getting to go to their stadium.
Yeah, I mean, historically their reputation is awful, but and it does come from the top. So that culture of change was driven, and it is very, very different now. Very different. So that hooligan element has kind of really gone. So it's a kind of a new breed, new culture, new philosophies and new ideas.
Maybe I should have picked a different club. I could have picked one of my old clubs, Chelsea.
let's go with Chelsea.
I could go with Chelsea and say historically, you look at the culture of Chelsea. When I went to the club, I went there in the mid-80s, and they were always associated with the flamboyant, flash, a little bit arrogance down the King's Road, the pretty boys, who always looked good, played good football, but didn't actually win anything. And that was the sort of mentality and the sort of culture of the club at that time. Obviously, Chelsea in that time is different from Chelsea now, because they've had a massive takeover, lots of money injected into the club, and it's now a club that has a much better winning mentality. But you speak to old Chelsea supporters from a certain generation, they'll speak about the team in the 60s and the 70s, the flamboyant days. Chelsea were one of the first group of players, you would say, playboy footballers, like Hudson, Osgood. They were always on the front page of the newspaper instead of the back pages, and it was a little bit different. And that is sort of associated a little bit with Chelsea. They still get tarred with that brush now.
Yeah, would you think, though, that, I know that when I worked at a club in Paddington, and there was a group of kids that went there, and they went to Chelsea, but they just went to fight. And Tottenham's the same, and they all had these little gangs, didn't they? Is that still prominent there?
That was a culture in British football at that time, and it's something that the authorities have worked very hard to change.
So the wider role of the club, we've all acknowledged up here, plays a role, obviously, in the culture that you're creating in your locker room. How much homework goes into that for the two of you when you're looking to take a job, when you're starting to discuss with a board of directors or with an FA, based on their history, their tradition, their rituals, and how it aligns with your leadership principles? How much research goes into that, or is it just a matter of getting the job you want and then dealing with the culture once you get in there?
I'll take that one, because I've had quite a lot of clubs, and then obviously you move around different clubs. I think for an individual, and maybe other people have a different feel. For me, I have to take my values and my principles into that club and hope that they fit in around what their values are. You go into every club, you assess the situation, you look. Normally you go to a club because they haven't been doing very well, so you go in there and you try to set a new level of standards, a new way of working. And it starts from the minute you walk in the door, when you have your first meeting and the first time you speak to your players or you speak to the staff that you've inherited, and you try to sell them your vision, how you see the club going forward. You try to put down your standards, your disciplines, your principles. You expect people to be in on time. You expect them to be always working for the good of the club, always giving their best for the club, not speaking against anybody so that everybody is pulling in the same direction. If you go into a club and everybody works in the same way, you have more chance of success.
I'll just take that from an international point of view. Having worked in England, I've done a lot of work abroad with teams. So I've been to Thailand, Africa, and for me, you have to respect the culture, I think, and it's really important. Otherwise, I think you could lose the players. So for me, you respect the culture, you try and understand the culture. And having travelled the world, I actually did research before I went into any of these countries, whether it was coach education, whether it was working with teams for a period of time. Really important to understand their way of life, how they see things, but then slowly drip parts of your values and your philosophies into their culture. It's very difficult to go in. For example, I went to Thailand for quite a bit of time, worked with their team, and I had to be very careful how I approached it. Just sat back a little bit, tried to understand how they worked, how they communicated, and all of those things are really important. Otherwise, I think you could lose people in an international setting, that is.
I think most cultures would probably say, and I'm generalizing, that when they have people from outside their culture come in, they would much prefer that they sat, watched, listened, learned, observed before they had their domineering personalities take over and start to establish those type of cultures. So I think that's a very nuanced way of looking at it. So both of you have talked about going in and making sure that the alignment of the club and your own philosophies mesh, that there's a synergy there. I think we'd all agree here that regardless of whether you try to create a culture in a locker room or in a club, it's going to be created no matter what. So you can either have a hand in it or not. So can you talk a little bit about culture by default versus culture by design and how maybe you might go in and try to start creating that from day one? Was that too convoluted a question?
Yeah.
It was a long question.
So culture's created no matter what. There's already a culture that's being established in this room for how we're doing things today. So we can try and influence how that's going to run today and have an influence on that culture, or we can just bypass it, not think about it, and let it be created by default and on its own. How would you as a manager, how do you view that? Are you more laissez-faire and let them develop their own? Do you come in and try to impose a culture? And if you do that, how do you do that?
I think it's a bit like, what I've experienced traveling the world. I think you have to sit back and see what's happening. And if there are things that don't quite fit with your personal culture, you try and change it. For me anyway, I would try and change it. I think culture from within and everybody's working on the same sheet is really important. But you can have a locker room where you can have different groups of people setting their own agendas. And a culture is about agenda as well, isn't it? It's about what you want to achieve at the end of it, whether it's a group agenda or a personal agenda or small group agenda. So I think if you go into an environment for the first time, you generally assess the situation, I think, and then you make those changes according to what you see, or not, because it might be, in your eyes, perfect. It might be the way you want it to be. But to go in straight away and start, I think can be quite challenging.
So you'd come in looking, learning, observing, Are you also slowly at that same time implementing your own vision and objectives and seeing what their take is on that as you're taking in the information from them?
Yeah, I think you're, as Hope says, you're looking, you're assessing, but you have to make, I think in club football, maybe it's slightly different in international football where you have a bigger spread between the matches and a longer time together. In a club environment, you can go into a club in the middle of a season. The club are in a downward spiral and you're trying to go in there and stop that spiral. So you have to go in quickly and identify where you think the problems are. Maybe there's a general casualness, players turning up for training at 5 minutes before you start training, bad manners in the canteen where they're leaving their dishes behind, not picking up their dishes properly. It's got nothing to do with football, but it's got to do with just putting in little standards and little behaviours. You can go in there immediately and say, look, come on, respect your environment, respect the football club, respect the people you work with. And on timekeeping, the one for me was always, I was never someone to go in and say, right, there's a set of rules, you have to follow those rules. You have to go in and you have to give them your values and say, look, this is disrespectful. If you're 5 minutes late for a team meeting, I don't want your money, I don't want to fine you. It's just being disrespectful to everybody else who's sitting waiting. And you have to take those little things in and try and build that slowly. And it won't always work, because you'll get the people who'll be sitting there thinking, yeah, we've just got rid of that, a manager, and this guy will be gone in a couple of weeks, a couple of months, a couple of years, you never know, and it will change again. So you have to work really hard to try and change those people's personal opinions, but that takes longer. You can change very quickly, I think, the sort of feel around the place where you're saying, we're doing it this way. You might not agree with it just now, but just work with it, and we'll get better, we'll get better, we'll get better. But you'll always get the ones that rebel a little bit against it, and they're the ones that you have to work on and maybe try and change over a period of time. In other words, get them out of the club and get someone else in.
Right. And I think it's really important, because generally you go in, and certainly in Steve's world, you generally go in when a club's in trouble, when they're losing and the manager's got sacked for poor results. So you can go in and go, right, there's a reason why you're losing, we're going to change. I'm sure it would be different if you were going into a club that was successful, because if it hasn't broke, why fix it? So I think it would be different depending on the circumstances. And I think as the person going in, you have to make those assessments, whether it's very quickly and change it very quickly, or sit back and, this is okay. So I think it depends where that team are. Mm-hmm. Are they successful, or are they really plummeting? That's important.
So those transitions can take place in many different ways, and then you either observing them or, depending on the situation, maybe setting down your marker.
I think
it depends on the situation, on how you would handle something like that. How does your backroom staff fit into that? What are their roles and responsibilities within that? Obviously, they're your eyes and your ears, but how much do you use them in relationship to helping create that culture?
Well, you like to think that you pick your backroom staff well, people who have the same principles, the same beliefs as you. They're not there to watch your back. They're there to give you, like you say, an extra pair of eyes, an extra pair of ears around the place. There's no point in you going in and setting down one formula and saying this is the way we want to work, and you've got somebody on your backroom staff who's not enforcing it or who's not helping to enforce it. And that's what they're there for. The role is that. That was, for a lot of my time, I was an assistant manager as opposed to a manager. So you go in and the manager sets a culture, he sets a formula, a way of working. And if I see someone coming in 5 minutes late for training, it's wrong of me to turn my back and say, well, I didn't see him. I have to address the situation and say, you're late. I have to tell the manager. Now, it might sound as though you're doing a little bit of telling tales, and the guy will be, don't bother, it was only 5 minutes, don't worry about it. But if you let that drift and you let that go, then the next day there'll be 2 people late, and then the next day there'll be 3 people late, and suddenly you've let your manager down. So it's very important that your staff are strong and able to stand up to people and say, no, this is what the manager wants, so please follow this way.
So you think it's crucial to have, obviously, your backroom staff believe in your vision, your culture, your way of doing it.
They have to believe in it.
I think that's pretty obvious.
It's really obvious, but when you go into a club, for example, I went to West Bromwich Albion, I only took one member with me, one of my staff. Mm-hmm. So I had to go in there and I had to make sure that the staff were in the club also understood and bought into the belief. So you have to sell it to them. You have
That
to
was your
sell
first
it.
job.
This is the right way. This is my first job. And it was going back to the point that Hope made. I wasn't going into a struggling environment, which is why I only took one. I only took one person because the club was well run, very well managed, some would say, by a dictator. I called him Mr. Chairman. But he ran it very, very well, and he ran it very, very strong. When the chairman turned up at the training ground, it was incredible for the staff who'd been there a long period of time. It was, they all sat up straight, everybody was working, everybody was at their desk, everybody was doing something. Nobody ever got caught sitting in the canteen when the chairman was coming. And I'd sit in the office and I'd hear the secretary phone out, Chairman's coming, and it would go all around the training ground. And by the time the chairman got there, everybody was hard at work. And that was the chairman, he had imposed that culture on the club. So for me to come in there, and I didn't have to come in and set down the rules. I think I spoke to a committee of players. I said, rules and responsibilities. And they pulled out a sheet of paper and said, Gaffer, there's our rules and responsibilities. We run the dressing room. We find ourselves, we self-discipline ourselves. And you could see that with the performances on the pitch.
And you were comfortable with that, so that's the...
I was very comfortable with that because it saved me from having to set down my agenda. I said, that's very good, please continue. Yeah. And they did, and they self-regulated themselves.
Yeah, the self-policing makes your job that much easier.
Much easier.
And to grow a group of leaders that can take that for you. I think every coach would want that as part of their culture.
Yep.
Anything to add, Hope?
No, I agree. I think certainly I handpicked my staff, so I think it's really important that you're all on the same page, and that you kind of agree that culture and what you want and how you want your environment to run. Very important. And I think I was very much about empowering the staff. You know, if something wasn't being done, then they had the authority to, I guess, reprimand, if you like. So for me, it's very much about empowering your backroom staff and all believing in the same vision. Because if one is off kilter, it can disrupt everything. And I have had to get rid of, you know, first of all, they believe and follow you, and all agree, and then suddenly one's off kilter. That's not going to work. So everybody has to be on the same page, going in the same direction. And if you can achieve that and empower your staff, that's great. It makes your life so much easier as the person in charge.
Was your staff fairly steady through the time that you had?
Yeah, pretty much.
So there was very few people that you had to weed out based on the culture of the staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and I think it's really important when you set a culture and environment that you always review, you know, because it can evolve depending on how the team are doing, the success of the team, you know, certain players, you know, it evolves and it changes, and it's quite important to always review. Are we going in the right direction? Is this the culture we want? I think that's really important, that you don't overlook that, even when it's going well. You know, unfortunately, a lot of the time when things go badly, it's suddenly when we go, right, we need to change things. But I think you always need to look at it, especially when it's going well. It's more crucial, I think.
Sure. Have you found differences as we as managers are getting older and the players are getting younger, so the difference in age between us and them is growing? Do you find a difference in being able to communicate with them? Do you find that they say that lectures in school now and with parents to children doesn't work nearly as much as it did in generations past, but with this new generation Y and the millennials, it's more about modeling the way, it's more about showing, it's not as much about giving them a lecture or a talk. Have you found that changing in the soccer world and in the locker room? As everybody giggles?
I think it does change, and it's also part of what Hope just said about reevaluating your staff all the time and constantly looking at what you do with your staff and how you work with your staff. When I became a coach or a manager, obviously you come out the dressing room and you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 years where you're coaching players that you've actually played beside, and you're from that generation, and suddenly you start to grow out of that. So one of the things I did in my last job, I felt that at 51 years of age, And you're right, you're looking at young 18, 19-year-old kids. Some of the things they do with the social media and the way they live their life now is completely different to the generation that I was brought up in. So I consciously looked to find a young coach, a coach who had just finished playing, was looking to make his way in the game, and I brought him onto my staff. It was Stephen Reid, who I'd worked with as a player at West Bromwich Albion. We struck up a good relationship there. He always came across as a very proper, correct, similar to my beliefs, the way he wanted his standards to be, the way he worked, the way he wanted to progress as a coach. And I just felt that to bring in a younger member of staff would be good for me, would give me a better connection with the dressing room. And although I didn't last very long at Reading, I know that Stephen was a very successful and popular appointment, and he's still working at Reading Football Club now.
Very good. So we're seeing those changes.
Yeah, I think it's important to be down with the kids. I think you have to understand the youth of today. And I guess in the work I do now, working in the boys' academies, I have a young cousin, so that really helps me. So it's really silly, but I understand the language of street kids. Mm-hmm. So if I can go in and be kind of that cool, younger, down with the kids, that really helps me actually, and that really works. I'm not now in a team environment. I go in and educate the young scholars and work with these kids who, talk a street language that actually I understand, and that's really cool. And they're very receptive to me because of that. So if you're an older coach, get down with the kids. You got to know what's going on. I think
in general, that's a very big piece of teaching pedagogy today is getting and starting with where they are. If you can meet them where they are and where they're comfortable, then you can take them along for the ride.
Yeah, you got to be cool.
They have to at least, whether that's cool, whether that's, and this is my opinion, I think there has to be a certain level of comfort that they have with you. Maybe a little bit of afraid, but comfortable enough that they're willing to open up and listen to you. Because if you never get that piece of it with them, if you never become connected to them, you can say whatever you want and you can model whatever you want about culture, but it probably goes nowhere.
I think you lose them. If you've got to make that, you've got to make a connection, I think, with younger players as you get older very quickly. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they look at you as the old person. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, hang on a minute.
And that's not the culture you want to be in? No. Okay. Questions from anybody at this point? Because I've got a few more. Go ahead in the front. Oh, wait a minute. I'm supposed to throw this at you. Yeah, there you go. How about that for goalkeeping distribution?
Yeah, I know they're recording it, so. All right. I have a loud voice anyway, so if I break it, I'm sorry in advance. So a youth coach, U16 boys. I have a question about, I enter the seasons, this is a thing I struggle with often, and across the teams that I've coached, it's repeated itself. So it may just be bad coaching, but I know you'll have a viewpoint on it. Developing a culture, having a set of rules, having an expectation of the way things are going to go, potentially having one or two players that don't buy in, and you're talking before about managing players out of, where you can find them, you have some options there, but you can't find a 15-year-old and you can't find their parents, you could, I suppose, it doesn't really work. Anyway, my question is, maybe do you have some advice for sort of what's the crossover point where somebody who's not adopting the culture becomes a liability and also has a functional role in the culture itself, right? Everybody sort of, if it's a leader on the team, they're going to follow their lead. I struggle with knowing sort of what's the point where you're managing that person out. What's the crossover point in your experience where you're saying this isn't going to work out? And we need to move you on, or you needed some other timeout for the off the field.
I don't think you can put a finite time on it. Obviously, your job as a coach is to get the best out of that player. So you have to find different ways to try and motivate them. You have to speak to them. You have to have maybe spend more time with that one player. If you feel that he's a particularly good player to have in your squad, and will be a leader for your squad and has a chance to develop in the game, I think you have to spend maybe a little bit more time on him than you would normally do, trying to find a way, trying to find a common ground, a little bit of empathy with him, find out why he's not buying into your ideas, find out the reasons, try and discuss the reasons with them, try and reason with them, and just keep working day in, day out, reinforcing what you want from him, asking him how he is, whether he thinks, what he thinks should change. Just keep firing back and find some common ground. Your job as a coach is to get the best out of that player on the pitch. But to get the best out of the player on the pitch, you have to get him on the pitch in a good state of mind and a frame of mind where he's thinking, yeah, I want to play for this guy. This guy's really good. Maybe you've said something to him that's upset him and you haven't realised it. And maybe he's holding that deep inside himself. You've got to find out, did I say something to upset you? And maybe it might take you a long time to coax out exactly what you said, and it might be something completely, for you, something that's irrelevant and you just dismissed immediately, and for him it just festered away in his head for a little bit and built up that resentment. So that would be the advice on that particular situation, or with that particular boy.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
There's another one in the back. Do you want to volley that to the back of the room?
Oh, good luck.
South row.
Okay. That's louder than I thought it was going to be. From a perspective of a footballing culture, when you come into a group and, I mean, we'll use Millwall because we talked about it. For example, Millwall wanted to be a little bit more like Arsenal. Coming into a group, there has to be some sort of point where you realise that the squad you have is not going to be capable of replicating Arsenal at Millwall. So how can you transition the footballing culture and the style and the system and the way that you go about it on the field while still being successful? And I say that as a Birmingham City supporter, where we've gone from Gary Rowett to Zola. We play much better football, but we're slowly drifting down the table. But as a Birmingham City fan, I'm torn because I'm very happy with the football, but the results aren't quite what we need. How long do you go? Do you come in straight away, or do you maybe adapt your own footballing philosophies in the short term?
Yeah, I just think if you come in and suddenly, depending on the standard of players you have, so if Birmingham haven't got players like, so they might play better football but they're not winning, I mean, Zola could find himself out of a job very, very quickly in the men's world. That changeover is very rapid. I just think if you come into an environment and they're not struggling, I think it takes time. I think you're talking about playing philosophies and styles. Playing philosophies and styles is very different to the overall culture of the club. So those philosophies of playing styles quite often can take a bit of time to embed. But you could do that, as Birmingham have done, to their detriment. It could be costly. So as the person in charge, you have to weigh that up, because in the modern day game, results are the things that count. So I think it can take a bit of time. You have to balance up between changing the style of play and winning to be changing the style of play and losing. So as a person responsible for the results, you have to think, what's more important at this period of time? Is it winning, or is it the way we play?
Stability.
Yeah, is it stability? So you've got to get the results. So I think that's just something that needs to be thought out. And if you want to change the style of play, just maybe do it gradually. Take time with it. Or if you're in a vulnerable position and you're down the league, and then you can go, right, we need to change this style of play because what we're doing currently isn't working. We need to change it to get results. I think it just depends where you're at.
I'll just jump in on that one because I worked with Gianfranco Zola at West Ham, and you're right, he has fantastic footballing philosophy. He wants his team to play great football, always passing, always entertaining football, always trying to win. And we had a spell at West Ham in our second season after the club had gone bankrupt, and we'd gradually sold a lot of players. And we found ourselves in a really tricky position near the bottom of the Premier League. And for the club to fall out of the league would have been a disaster. And I had to have it was a difficult meeting with Gianfranco. We were really good friends. And I felt, in my opinion, as his assistant, I had to give him some advice that maybe we should stop playing so much nice football to make it simple, nice football, and be a little bit more direct, be a little bit more horrible, and just get the results that would get the points that would keep us in the Premier League. And then going into the next season, we'd be able to build on that. We did manage to get the points. We didn't play great football, but we managed to pick up enough points to stay in the league. But we didn't get the chance to go into the next season because Gianfranco got sacked. And I always feel that our relationship got just a little bit damaged because of that, because he felt that I had made him give up his principles a little bit, and he lost his job anyway. If that, just to give you a little insight to how people think in the game and footballers think. In the Birmingham City one, for me, it's really simple to explain. Gary Rowett took over the club when they had no money. They were at the bottom of the English Championship. He developed a team of fighters, a very direct, aggressive way of playing that was successful. And he bought players to the club. He brought those players in and he placed them into the team, and he made the team in his image. So to change from Gary Rowett in the middle of the season, who is a particular type of coach, and put in Gianfranco, and this all happened about because there was a change of ownership at the club. There was new owners came in and they wanted to bring their own coach, but they didn't think it through. It would have been better to make that change at the end of the season when the new coach can bring his own players, can impose his own style on the club over a period of time. And those are the things that you're up against in modern day senior football, where results are, unfortunately, from a certain viewpoint, results are the most important thing.
Go ahead.
What's one element that you think is very important that you'll see in a successful culture? What's the one really, really important element? What's the one very, very important element that you see in a successful team culture that you've seen over and over and over again that people will rally around?
I think for me, unity, togetherness, really everybody on the same page, going in the same direction. Very simple for me.
Thank you.
Exactly the same. If everyone's pulling in the same direction, you've got a chance to be successful.
Thank you.
This may be aimed a bit more at Steve from the club background, but you've worked with some top managers, and can you share with us their different styles and how they are? I'm sure we're all interested to find out, how Jose is in comparison to Kenny Dalglish, for instance.
I think two managers from different generations. Kenny, you would put down as more an old style English manager who valued building a working relationship with his players. He didn't coach the players, so he didn't have that day-to-day work with the players on the training pitch. He was always out there, but I was the coach and Kenny was the one, and he would always be walking around talking to this player, talking to that player, and building a relationship. And it was quite interesting because Mourinho was very driven and very, very intense, and sometimes it's really hard to work for. And he had that was his philosophy, his culture, if you like, was to be driven, was to be the winning mentality, and nobody could slacken off, nobody could have an easy day. Everything was boom, 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 very, very intense day in, day out. And it wears you down a little bit. And when I went to Liverpool to work with Kenny, I would be putting on training sessions, and I'd be looking at the training session, and I'd be siding over to Kenny going, "It's not very good this morning, Kenny, it's rubbish. Stop it. Give them a bollocking, for wanting a better word." And you go, "Nah, let them go. Let them go. They were out last night. I heard they were out in town last night, and they're probably a little bit tired this morning. Nah, let it go. Let it go. They'll pay you back." And he was a big one on that. They would come, and maybe none of the players at Chelsea that I can think of would ever go to Mourinho and say, "Boss, we're going for a night out. The lads are having a little dinner. Can we have the day off tomorrow?" It never happened. But at Liverpool, they would go to Kenny, "Listen, the boys are going out, team night out, taking the wives, it's going to be a late night. Can we have tomorrow off?" And Kenny would go, "Yeah, all right." And I used to look at him and think, "Kenny, you're encouraging them to, they'll pay us back on Saturday, don't worry. You make them feel good, you give them a little bit of responsibility, they'll be ready to go Saturday, they'll pay you back." So that would be a a little difference between those two particular managers.
And I'm guessing that came through Kenny and his history and tradition at the club.
It would come from probably the culture of Liverpool. If you think, going back to the culture, Liverpool was the boot room, where everybody would go in after the game. The opposition manager would come in, the opposition coaches, everybody would go in there, and they'd just discuss everything about football. Not necessarily the game that's just played, but they would just talk and talk and talk and talk, and sometimes it would take you forever to get out. But it was a great environment, and it's something that is synonymous with Liverpool Football Club.
So does that boot room, that example, do you see that in many clubs? Not necessarily the boot room itself, but the idea that tradition, that history, that culture of the club comes from the top and bleeds down. And when I say the top, I mean the technical staff? Or do you see more often that it comes from Abramovich taking over Chelsea and a culture change in that way that took place? Or is it something that bleeds through from the bottom, from the grassroots level, and comes up through the academy, through the club? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Is it a mix? Is it different from club to club?
That's another one of your really long questions. You've confused me again.
It's the only chance I've had to speak the whole morning. So essentially, have you seen it more often where that culture comes from the top down? Or does it come more from the grassroots level and through?
I think if you take the Liverpool one, for example, is from a certain period in time. So is more a historical thing. And it was passed on from this manager to that manager to that manager to that manager. I don't know if they have the boot room now, because they've changed the main stand. So they've had a redevelopment of the ground. They've got a foreign manager in place in Jurgen Klopp. And I don't know if they still have the boot room. As such, I don't know if they have anything like that, but it's normal anyway to invite the opposition manager to come for a drink after the game, just for a glass of wine and a chat. But whether they still call it the boot room or whether it's changed and evolved and it's going to be something else in the future, but the boot room is synonymous with a certain period of the history of Liverpool Football Club when they were very successful.
How about from the grassroots going up? Is it important that the club is the academy serve a purpose of not only helping in the player development part, but does it also help in the cultural development of the player coming through the club?
Go on. This is yours.
Yeah, it does. I think if you have any football club or any group of football supporters, which basically is the football club, the supporters make the club, loves to see someone from their academy playing in the first team. You know, I'm looking at the results this morning's game, and I saw that Harry Kane scored a hat-trick for Tottenham Hotspur. I can bet everybody in this room that the crowd were singing, "We love Harry Kane, he's one of our own," because he's come through from that size all the way through the club. He understands the tradition of the club, the values of the club, and for those supporters, they can identify, oh, Harry Kane, one of our boys. And I think that is very important. If you can manage to do that and get a number of players through, your supporters will love them, and your supporters will also be a little bit more forgiving with a young player who's come through the academy system. Whereas if you buy a player in from outside and after 5 games he hasn't done very well, the crowd will tell him that he hasn't done very well. Whereas with a young boy, they'll always be looking to encourage him, and it may take 15, 20 games. As a young boy, if you struggle, you don't get 15, 20 games, but as an extreme example, they would give the young boy more time to adapt and play for their club because he's one of their boys.
So if you're trying to establish a culture of patience, play your young kids.
Maybe, but at the very top level, if you play your young kids and you're not getting results, you're going out the door.
Yeah.
So you have to balance the policy. You have to try and integrate 1 or 2 if you can.
Right.
Sometimes I've never done it myself, but there are examples sometimes if a manager is struggling and the results are not going quite right, suddenly you'll find that he throws 2 or 3 young kids into the team. I'm giving the kids a chance. We got beat, yeah, we got beat, but look, this one's playing and this one's playing and this one's playing. And maybe he can find a way to start winning matches because the crowd are more positive. So rather than criticising the team because they're not winning, they're encouraging the team because, hey, let's help the kids. Let's hope the kids can progress and and stay in the team for a long time.
How did you see it with the kids coming through the youth national team program and then into the full team?
The culture set from the top internationally. I think, certainly all the kids coming through had to kind of follow the philosophy and culture that was created from the top, so it went top down. And interestingly, internationally, just at the FA, when Fabio Capello came in, the culture was very different with the men's England teams. Yeah, some stories of a more disciplined culture to when perhaps Sven was there. So internationally, it does quite often come from the top down, historically.
Okay. We're starting to run out of time, but I guess I'll open this up to both of you. The biggest challenge you faced in building or implementing a culture? Is there a story you could tell us about when you first went into the national team or a difficult locker room where there was a broken culture that you had to walk into, and how did that go?
I think for me, my biggest challenge was that I went straight from being a player. So I retired today and I became the England manager tomorrow, and was working with the players that I played with. And then obviously had to, kind of be patient and trying to create my culture from a culture that was before me, which some of it I kept and some of it I didn't keep. Obviously, I wanted to put my own thoughts and my own philosophies on that, trying to convince those players that I'd played with that this is the way that I want it to be was quite a challenge. But it was a good challenge, I think, because in the end they thankfully bought into it. So that was an interesting period, because I wanted to change things and do things my way and implement my culture, my philosophies into something that I'd been part of with a lot of these players for 15 years. So that was interesting, but managed to do it, thankfully.
Was there a lot of success when you were there as a player? And then also when you became the manager, was it one and the other?
I think, I'd like to think we were successful. I mean, when I was a player, I won a silver and a bronze European championship, so that was quite good. But I think at that time, the resources weren't there when I was a player. And then when I became manager, they started to invest a little bit more. So we were able to do things and change things a little bit more. And then the players could see, there are positive changes. And then over the years, I just managed to grow and build on that. And with that, bring my own culture, identity, philosophy along with that. And it was accepted.
So part of your challenge was getting a cultural change at the FA level, not just in the team.
God, yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
So that's what it was, managing upwards, really.
Oh, yeah, upwards, sideways and downwards, every which way possible. But, it was hard. And when come from an institution like that who at the time didn't value women's football, it was also trying to change the culture of the FA and their mindset and how they valued the women's game, which I'm sure there are women in the room probably struggle with that still today. It still goes on. So that was it was a cultural change, not just from the team, but from the governing body and the organisation, because institutionally, they were never pro women's football back then, right. And thankfully they are now.
Right. Any final questions from the audience? To hat on.
Thanks. Going back to Millwall, what are they doing to change their culture? Is it a team culture? Is it the organization? Are they reaching out to the fans? What is it, a broad kind of thing that they're looking to change, or is it specifically just the organization and their players?
No, I think I'm regretting using Millwall as an example, but you go back now, and the biggest change in Millwall now is trying to become is very, very big in the community now. It's a community club. It's trying to embrace its local community, whereas before it was always a sort of focal point for historically it was the dockyards, so the shippers and the boys that did all the hard graft down there were the core support. And like I said before, they tried to sideline that group and push them out a little bit and embraced the local community. I think the borough is Lewisham, and it became very proactive in the community, working in the schools and taking out the message that, listen, it's a football club, it's not a battleground, it's something that you should embrace as a community and come along and help. And that started at the top, and hopefully it'll take a number of years, it'll take a number of times, it maybe take a generation, but hopefully in the future they will become known as Millwall Football Club, the community club, the family club. That is what they want.
They were actually one of the first clubs to start what we had back then, the Women's Centre of Excellence. They were almost the driving force behind women's football. They had the largest, because of football in the community, which is where I came through, they had the largest population of female players at that time, back in the, whenever it was, I won't give the date, many years ago. So that whole community programme kind of tried to change the face of how Millwall as a football club was viewed. So more about community, more about family, more about inclusion, i.e. girls as well as boys. So this whole cultural shift, because it was all, if you spoke about Millwall back in the 80s, it was all about hooliganism. And there's, plenty of films in England that have been, hooligan stories that have been based on Millwall. So that they're just trying to change their identity, really. Really done some really good work to do that.
So as a youth, high school and college coach, would there be parallels with working with the community and parents and kind of building a culture from them as well?
Yeah, closer relationships. And then what they tried to do through, probably Steve knows more about this, but I was a player that came through that, was by engaging with the community, trying to get that community, mums, dads, girls, to come to the games and try and get rid of that hooligan element, so make it more of a family club. That's what they aimed for. So, and they did some really good work around that, and still do, actually.
Cool. Nice.
Last one.
Do you feel you can change the culture once you've already been there as a coach for a little while? If there's some things you don't like your rules and regulations, you want to change, how it is, even though you already have those players there and you've been there for a couple of years?
I think you're just talking about sort of ongoing monitoring of your program. You're always looking to assess and reassess what you're doing. So that it may be something that you set down as a rule or a discipline when you first went into the club has changed, and there's something slightly different. You have to tweak it a little bit. It's maybe not such a big issue anymore because everybody's bought into it and it's passing this out the way. So you don't have to deal with that. You reassess and you think, that part of the training ground's not particularly good, or maybe the players have a common area and you walk in there one day and after years of them looking after it, you walk in and suddenly it's a mess and there's stuff lying around. You just have to go and reinforce and say, look, you've got the locker room that's always tidy. Every time you go in there, it's great, all the kit's put away properly, but your common room is a mess. And it's just a tiny example, but your common room's a mess now, so you change slightly and you change your rules. So it's not just the locker room you have to keep tidy, you have to keep the locker room and the common room tidy. Small example, but I hope it answered your question.
I think the thing is, when you're trying to set a culture, a philosophy, a vision, whatever, I think the thing that's paramount is you need to review, reflect and review, and then plan and do. So it's the review, plan and do cycle. And you have to keep doing that, especially when you're successful. Because when you're successful, you think, it's all right. But before you know it, it can very quickly change, So you've got to do that constantly, whether it's, I don't know, once every month, 6 months, whatever. But review, reflect and review, plan and do.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Yeah, it really is. I think that kind of sums up exactly what we've been talking about in creating that culture, having it change over time, reevaluating it, planning, and then doing. thank you so much for your time this morning. I hope it was worth your while. It certainly was for me.
Thank you.
Stephen, Hope, thank you.